In February 1983, North London was shaken by a horrifying crime that sent shockwaves across the United Kingdom. According to reports, a serial killer had brutally murdered dozens of victims. He once claimed he could have killed 500 people if he had not been stopped. It all started with an investigation into mysterious human remains found in the sewers. At that moment, the London police realized they might be dealing with one of the most horrific cases of the era. The perpetrator was none other than Dennis Nilsen, one of the most notorious serial killers in British history. So, what really happened? How did he carry out these gruesome murders? Hit like and subscribe to our channel as we uncover the full truth. Around 4 p.m. on Tuesday, February 8, 1983, residents of Cranley Gardens repeatedly complained about their toilets being unusable due to severe pipe blockages that had lasted for 5 days. Under pressure from residents, the landlord urgently contacted Mike Carton, a plumber, to inspect the issue. Less than 15 minutes later, Mike and his colleague Jim Alec arrived. They decided to open the sewer cover connected to the city's drainage system, hoping to find the cause of the blockage. As soon as Mike opened the sewer cover, a strong, foul stench immediately hit his nose. He quickly grabbed a flashlight and carefully stepped into the darkness. The deeper Mike went, the stronger the strange smell became, a scent he had never encountered before. As he approached the junction between the building's pipes and the city drainage system, he saw a pile of unusual waste. It didn't look like human waste, but more like decomposing flesh and fat. Both men realized this could be a serious issue for the building. They decided to call their supervisor to report the situation. However, their boss did not believe them, assuming they were mistaken due to the darkness. Eventually, Mike and Jim Alec requested to re-examine the site the following morning when there would be enough daylight to properly assess the problem. At 9 a.m. on February 9th, Mike and his colleague returned. However, to their surprise, the strange substance was no longer there. The sewer was now clear, and their previous suspicions seemed to have been dismissed. Their job was considered done, and everything appeared to be resolved. However, Mike and Jim Alec had no idea that while they were discussing the flesh and fat that had clogged the pipes, a resident named Fiona Priest had already called the police. Fiona Priest suspected that the substance might be linked to a murder case. She reported that the previous night, she had heard the footsteps of a man entering the manhole and had no idea why he was there at such a late hour. At 5:40 p.m. on February 9th, 1983, in London, Chief Inspector Peter J. received a report about human remains found in the drainage system of an apartment building in Cranley Gardens. According to the investigation, the pipes led up to an apartment on the 3rd floor belonging to a man named Dennis Nilsen. The detectives waited outside the apartment until Dennis Nilsen returned, then informed him that they were there to check the blocked pipes. They then asked for permission to go up to Nilsen's private room for a more discreet conversation. As soon as they stepped inside, they were immediately hit by a strong, strange odor filling the entire room. With years of investigative experience, Inspector J immediately recognized the source of the disturbing stench. He looked straight at Nilsen and coldly asked, "Where is the rest of the body?" Nilsen showed no surprise. He calmly replied, "In the wardrobe." J wasted no time and immediately ordered Assistant Inspector Jeff Chambers to check. Chambers opened the wardrobe, revealing decomposed body parts in front of them. Dennis Nilsen was arrested on the spot and escorted to a police car. Inspector Chambers looked straight at the killer and asked sternly, "Are the remains in the apartment from 1 or 2 people?" Nilsen pondered for a moment before coldly responding, 15 or 16, I think." At the police station, detectives assigned a lawyer to assist Nilsen during the interrogation. However, he showed no hesitation, answering every question directly without paying attention to the lawyer's advice. Dennis Nilsen calmly admitted to killing at least 15 people. He did not even remember all of his victims' names. He described in detail where he had hidden the bodies. "You will find more in a tea chest in the bedroom. Then in the bathroom drawer, the remains of 3 people are still there." He continued, "At 195 Melrose Avenue, N2, you'll find 12 or 13 more from 1978. Dennis Nilsen said he had met his victims only once at completely random locations, on the street, in bars, or in public places. According to Nilsen, some of the victims were homeless and drug addicts. He continued answering questions about the victims' identities, stating that all of them were male, but of unknown age. Nilsen stated that, of the 3 bodies found at Cranley Gardens, the last victim had been killed 3 weeks earlier, while the others had been dead for about a year. Naturally, the older bodies had nearly completely decomposed. The forensic examination concluded that the bodies from Dennis Nilsen had been dissected with a high level of skill, making it relatively easy to differentiate the parts. The head of the last victim had been boiled to the point of being unrecognizable. Although most of the fingers were severely decomposed, one remained intact enough to identify fingerprints. Additionally, the autopsy provided information about the cause of death. Initially, the victim was believed to have died from strangulation with a thin object like a fishing line. However, the autopsy revealed that the victim's lungs were filled with water, indicating drowning as the cause of death. Furthermore, the forensic examination revealed that the victim had hepatitis B, a common disease among heroin addicts. As for the bodies at Melrose, Nilsen handled them differently. He lived on the ground floor, with plenty of storage space beneath the floorboards and a backyard. After clearing the space, the bodies began to decay and emit odors. On weekends, Nilsen would clean them himself to avoid being overwhelmed by the stench. Nilsen would pull the bodies from under the floor, place them in plastic garbage bags to keep things tidy, and then move them to the kitchen for dismemberment. Over time, Dennis Nilsen became highly skilled in dismembering bodies, developing proficiency through repeated practice. Once everything was done and the area was cleaned, he would wrap the body parts in an old carpet and burn them. To mask the smell, Nilsen would place a tire on top, allowing the rubber to overpower the scent of burning flesh. Nilsen added in a calm voice, "I had to do it. My house had no more space." The interrogation continued with Dennis Nilsen's statements about how he murdered his victims. He stated that the killings always took place at his home, and all the victims voluntarily came to his apartment. After 2 hours of questioning, Nilsen's statements meant nothing unless he provided clear names to confirm the identities of the 15 people he had killed. Therefore, the police set out to verify the names, while Nilsen was held in custody until the evidence could be confirmed. News of the discovery of human remains in the drainage system quickly spread through the community. The media captured images of the police collecting evidence at the Cranley Gardens apartment. However, the investigation at Dennis Nilsen's workplace did not go smoothly. His colleagues refused to believe he could have committed such atrocities, so the police needed authorization from higher-ups to proceed with the search. Additionally, police discovered that Dennis Nilsen had once been a police officer in Willesden, northwest London, but left the force in 1973, 10 years before the remains were discovered. In a subsequent interview, Nilsen himself confirmed this information. He explained that he hadn't mentioned it before because, while he was a police officer, he hadn't killed anyone, so he believed it was irrelevant. However, Inspector Steve McCusher whispered to Inspector Peter J. about a disturbing rumor involving Dennis Nilsen. He said that the real reason he was expelled from the police force was because someone caught him pleasuring himself in the morgue. The interview returned to discussing names, starting with the last victim, who was known to be Scottish. Nilsen thought for a moment before blurting out, "Stephen?" His name was Stephen. This statement worried the lawyer, as his client was incriminating himself too quickly. However, Nilsen ignored the lawyer's advice. He simply wanted to end this and politely asked the lawyer to leave. The interview continued with Nilsen's confession about murdering Stephen. He recounted meeting the victim outside a McDonald's, where Stephen had gone several days without food. Stephen was a homeless man, around 25 years old. Nilsen couldn't resist offering help. After buying Stephen a meal, he took him home. They drank, laughed, and shared their past experiences. Stephen revealed that he had been kicked out of his home at 12 years old after his parents discovered he was using drugs. Later, his parents tried to find him, but he had already fallen too deep into addiction. Unwilling to be controlled, Stephen decided to run away with a group of drifters. For over 10 years, he wandered the streets of London, surviving on the generosity of strangers. The story paused when the inspector demanded that Nilsen provide the victim's full name. Nilsen struggled to recall his surname, a name with a distinctive Scottish ring. Then he remembered: Sinclair. Detectives quickly searched for information on the name Sinclair Stephen. According to Nilsen, Stephen Sinclair was a drug addict who likely had a prior criminal record. Not long after, the police received a report. By cross-referencing records of individuals with prior arrests, they confirmed the last victim's identity as Stephen Sinclair. This evidence conclusively proved that Dennis Nilsen was responsible for the murder of Stephen Sinclair. Detectives Peter J. and Steve McCusher visited Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair, Stephen Sinclair's parents, to inform them of their son's death. Although they had nearly disowned Stephen, hearing of his death still brought them immense grief. At the same time, the media began spreading news about the murderer who preyed on men, Dennis Nilsen. To understand the motives and origins of Dennis Nilsen's cruelty, investigators delved into his past, step by step uncovering the dark childhood and twisted mindset that shaped his path to crime. Our main character, Dennis Nilsen, was born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, a small town in northern Scotland, where most people relied on fishing for a living. Dennis Nilsen was the second child in the family, which had a total of 3 siblings. He had an older brother named Olaf Jr. and a younger sister named Sylvia. His mother, Elizabeth White, was a housewife, while his father, Olaf Nilsen, was a Norwegian soldier stationed in Scotland. After getting married, Dennis Nilsen's parents moved in with his maternal grandparents. Over the next 3 years, the Nilsen family welcomed 3 more children. However, when Olaf completed his assignment in Scotland, the couple decided to separate. Olaf returned to Norway and only occasionally visited his children. Aside from those visits, no one knew where he was. As a child, Dennis was very close to his grandfather, Andrew, who spent all his time taking care of him. However, Dennis Nilsen's fate took a sudden turn when he was 6 years old. The passing of his grandfather was a devastating shock for the child. Seeing her son fall into despair, Elizabeth, like many mothers, tried to explain to Dennis why his grandfather had died and what the afterlife was. In Dennis's eyes, his grandfather was merely asleep for a long time and had moved on to a better place. When Dennis turned 14, he realized he was homosexual. Dennis felt discomfort from those around him, especially from his older brother, Olaf Jr., who often mocked and ridiculed his sexuality. Olaf Jr. called Dennis hen, a term meaning girl, in the Scottish dialect. At 16, Dennis was an excellent student with good grades, but he still decided to drop out of school. Dennis announced to everyone his intention to join the military. During the interrogation, Nilsen revealed that his time in the army was the happiest period of his life. The environment around him intensified his desires, but to avoid suspicion, Dennis often hid in the bathroom, indulging in his fantasies alone. Additionally, his twisted mind increasingly craved more intense physical experiences. Dennis began engaging in excessive physical intimacy and sought ways to get close to his male colleagues to satisfy his urges. At night, he would sneak into his comrades' rooms and secretly touch their bodies while they were asleep. It wasn't long before his strange behavior was discovered, making him the target of bullying and group violence, accompanied by cruel insults. However, instead of feeling ashamed or hurt, he seemed satisfied. He even enjoyed the abuse from his fellow soldiers. After 3 years of training in the army, at the age of 19, Dennis Nilsen was deployed to Germany for his duties at a military base. There, Dennis frequently had bizarre dreams. He saw his comrades unconscious or dead. In these dreams, Dennis would perform disturbing acts on their bodies. Sometimes, he imagined himself as the one who was unconscious and being exploited. To prolong these strange dreams, Dennis began abusing alcohol. He drank more and more, to the point where his comrades often had to carry him back to his quarters to rest. Nilsen always hoped that the soldier bringing him home would take advantage of him while he was intoxicated. However, all of this remained confined to his imagination. At night, he lost himself in his twisted fantasies. During the day, he was exhausted and frustrated, sobering up just enough to continue his military duties. This sense of unease followed him for a long time, at least until he completed his military service in Germany. In 1973, Dennis left the army and enrolled in police training. During a visit to the morgue for an autopsy examination, he discovered within himself a disturbing fascination with the lifeless bodies before him. On one occasion, Dennis was caught in the act by a colleague who reported him. This incident led to a reprimand from his superiors and caused his colleagues to distance themselves from him. Eventually, Dennis decided to resign. After that, Dennis transitioned into recruitment work for manual laborers. He performed exceptionally well and quickly rose through the ranks, becoming a senior manager at a prestigious company in London. Thanks to his managerial position, Nilsson rented a house at 195 Melrose Avenue. Before signing the lease, he requested exclusive use of the garden. The landlord agreed, as he saw nothing unusual about a tenant who enjoyed gardening. Dennis frequently visited gay bars, seeking casual relationships. However, these encounters did not bring him any emotional connection. Instead, they left him feeling increasingly empty. Until Dennis Nilsson met David Galligan, a 33-year-old man. This time, he seemed to take the relationship more seriously. Dennis invited David Galligan to move in with him at 995 Melrose Avenue, North London. However, despite living together, Galligan denied any homosexual relationship between them. When David Galligan left, Dennis gradually lost control, sinking into a spiral of alcohol, desire, and loneliness. Afraid of being abandoned once again, Dennis began to nurture the idea of killing his lovers to keep them with him forever. On December 30th, 1978, at the Bricklewood Aram Bar, Dennis began his hunt for prey. His first victim was Stephen Dean Holmes, a boy only 14 years old. After meeting Dennis at a bar and following him home, Holmes unknowingly became the first victim in his horrifying killing spree. The next morning, when Holmes tried to leave, Dennis immediately restrained him with a phone charger cord, wrapping it around his neck. He then pressed Holmes's body into a bucket of water, holding him down until the boy was completely lifeless. Afterward, Dennis dragged Holmes' body next to his bed. He continued to sleep, talk, and even have dinner with the boy as if he were still alive. A few days later, he decided to hide Holmes' body under the floor, in the crawl space designed for heating and insulation. This very spot became Holmes' secret tomb, where Dennis kept the boy's body for 8 months. Until summer, in early August 1979, the oppressive heat filled the entire room with the stench of decomposition. Unable to hide it any longer, Dennis decided to burn Holmes' body in the garden. After the death of Stephen Holmes, Dennis fell back into loneliness. He had no one by his side, and the search for a new companion began again. This time, he happened to meet Andrew Ho, a Chinese student who had come to England for academic courses. Andrew was strong-willed and enjoyed bold relationships. This excited Dennis, making him believe he had found the right person. But as soon as Andrew stepped into Dennis's apartment, he was suddenly attacked, with Dennis tightening a tie around his neck, choking him. Fortunately, Andrew managed to fight back and escape. Immediately after, he reported the attack to the police. When the police arrived to investigate, Dennis adamantly denied all accusations. He claimed it was just a playful game between the two. The police reviewed the statements and concluded that it was just a misunderstanding between two individuals. Eventually, they ended the investigation and left. The second known victim was Kenneth O'Cannon, a 23-year-old Canadian student visiting London in December 1979 to see his friends. At a bar, Kenneth met Dennis, who, after a few drinks, appeared to be extremely friendly. Taking advantage of his local knowledge, Dennis offered to show Kenneth around London. Kenneth quickly agreed. The two had an enjoyable afternoon before Kenneth followed Dennis home for dinner and drinks. After finishing the meal, Kenneth sat in an armchair in the living room, wearing headphones and listening to music. Seeing this scene, Dennis's obsession resurfaced. He knew that one day, Kenneth would have to return to Canada, and they would never see each other again. Dennis couldn't let that happen. He pretended to ask Kenneth if he could borrow the headphones. The moment Kenneth removed his headphones, Dennis suddenly wrapped a cable around his neck, tightening it until he lost consciousness. Afterward, he treated Kenneth like an inanimate object, casually sleeping next to the victim's body throughout the night. The next morning, Dennis dressed Kenneth's body, placed it in a wardrobe, and went to work as if nothing had happened. Every evening after work, he would take Kenneth's body out of the wardrobe, place it on the sofa, and quietly converse with his friend. He drank, watched TV, and listened to music as if Kenneth were still alive. Dennis even convinced himself that Kenneth was the perfect friend because he couldn't resist or leave him. A few weeks later, Kenneth suffered the same fate as Stephen. His body was hidden beneath the floorboards. Kenneth's body began to decompose. Dennis tried using air fresheners and insecticides, but all efforts were in vain. With no other option, Dennis was forced to dispose of all his friends. By the time he was arrested, his victim count had reached at least 15 people. The media called him the British Jeffrey Dahmer, comparing him to the infamous American serial killer. On February 10th, Dennis led the police to Melrose Avenue, pointing out 3 locations in the backyard where he had burned the victim's remains. On February 11th, 1983, Dennis Nilsen was officially charged with the murder of Stephen Sinclair. He was transferred to HMP Brixton to await trial. On October 24th, 1983, Dennis Nilsen's trial took place at Old Bailey, where he faced 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against him was undeniable. Prosecutors described him as a cold-blooded killer who showed no remorse for his crimes. His detailed confessions about how he killed his victims sent chills through the courtroom. On November 4th, 1983, the jury sentenced Dennis Nilsen to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The public was outraged, demanding changes in the legal system to ensure that serial killers like Dennis Nilsen would never have a chance at parole. In 2018, Dennis Nilsen died at the age of 72 due to health complications while imprisoned at HMP Full Sutton. When news of Dennis Nilsen's death was announced, most people in the UK felt relieved. They saw it as an inevitable and well-deserved end for a brutal serial killer. Thank you for following this story. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel to never miss more terrifying and mysterious crime cases. Remember, no matter how frightening the truth is, it must be told so that justice is always upheld.